Hi, I'm Mario Ariave with Utmost Performance Coaching. The topic of today's video, I'm going to discuss threshold and VO2 max training. And yes, I am going to discuss both of them in this video at the same time, and I'm going to be saying a lot of the same things about both of them with one small difference thrown in there. Now, the first thing that I want to go ahead and establish with you guys is the fact that threshold and VO2 max training are to be done aerobically. In other words, they're to be done with the presence of oxygen. Now, any kind of training that we do does have oxygen required in order to be able to do it. But with threshold VO2 max training, there is supposed to be sufficient oxygen supply to be able to get to the muscles so that the muscles can do the intended work. And, for a lot of you guys, that makes sense when we're talking about threshold training. If you've done threshold intervals and you've done them correctly, sure, they are on the difficult side, but you feel as though you're kind of in control of them and you can do them with, sure, a little bit of strain, but it's not tremendous to the point where you maybe don't feel that you can complete the intervals and or the session itself. With VO2 max, this seems a little bit more maybe off cue, because if you've done some VO2 max work, maybe you've noticed that it's really, really hard to keep up with that effort, and or you've met with some failure and you've not been able to complete the intervals in terms of the number of them, or maybe in terms of the duration of those particular intervals. But I want to hit pause here and I want to say it again. Threshold and VO2 max training are predominantly to be done aerobically. These are aerobic systems and pathways that you are trying to train. Therefore, oxygen should be present in sufficient amount to be able to supply the muscles to be able to do the work. Now, I want to go ahead and use an analogy to be able to do this. So everybody knows and everybody's familiar with the idea of a credit card. Now, if we go to purchase something and we don't have enough money to purchase that particular item, we can go ahead and take out a credit card. We can swipe it. It's not money that we have, but we're essentially borrowing in order to be able to get that particular item. So I want to apply that analogy to this idea of threshold and VO2 max training. Let's start with threshold. When you're performing a threshold interval, you have a certain amount of oxygen available in your system. Now, if you begin to run low on oxygen and you need some, you can pull out that credit card and you can swipe it and it will provide more oxygen even though you don't have it. That's not necessarily going to be exactly the case. You would go into an anaerobic state where your body is performing without oxygen, but you can keep exercising, okay? So with threshold work, as you're performing those intervals, what you should be thinking to yourself is, I'm not really needing that credit card. I'm not in danger of needing to pull it out. My hand isn't on my back pocket ready to pull out my wallet and take that credit card out. I'm not thinking about the fact that I should need to swipe that particular credit card. And so we're thinking about it as you're doing those threshold intervals, and that should be the mindset. That should be the analogy that you should be using to be able to do that kind of work. If you're beginning to think about needing that credit card, swiping that credit card, then maybe one of two things is happening. Maybe those intervals are too long, or maybe the zone at which you're trying to ride is too high for you at this particular time. Now, moving over to VO2 max, the reason why it's more difficult for some people to say, really, VO2 max is an aerobic pathway? The reason is because in this case, when we're doing VO2 max intervals, we actually may have our hand on our back pocket. We may even have our wallet out. We may even have it open. We may even have that credit card in our hand, but notice, we don't swipe it. We're thinking about it because the intensity is higher than a threshold interval is, but yet we're not really going to use it. We're thinking that maybe we might have to, but we're not. Once again, when doing VO2 max intervals, if you need to swipe that credit card because you don't have that oxygen available in your system and you're having to go anaerobic, in other words, you're having to fuel this effort without the presence of oxygen, then what that means is that either your interval is at too high of an intensity or it's too long in duration. And so when you're performing these types of intervals, that should be what you should be thinking about. These are aerobic pathways. They are to be done with the presence of oxygen. And that's a big misnomer, because a lot of times what we think about is threshold needs to be really, really, really hard. And oh my gosh, VO2 needs to be like even harder. We really need to be going over the top on these. And although these sessions should be challenging, because they are intensity sessions in the polarized pathway, we are looking at these being labeled as intensity sessions that go into that 20% if we're doing the 80-20 split. But those threshold intervals, yes, they're difficult, but what gets us there is the duration of time in which we're doing those intervals for. So we're doing them for 30 minutes worth of threshold intervals, and then we move to 40 minutes total of threshold intervals. It's the same thing with VO2 max, albeit it's a step higher because it's a higher and it's a more intense zone that you're going to be riding at. But either way, we should be fueling. We should not have to be swiping that credit card because the oxygen is not available. The last thing that I want to say, and this is a big one, is I know I've been talking about going anaerobic. When you go anaerobic, that does not mean there is no oxygen present. Let's just think about this from a logical standpoint and just back away from even exercise. If you don't have oxygen present in your system, you're dead. So the other misnomer that I kind of want to end this video with is just because you go anaerobic does not mean there is no oxygen present. Obviously, there's still oxygen present because you're alive. However, what it does mean is the oxygen that you have available is no longer able to sustain the intensity at which you're trying to ride. So therefore, you are needing to operate without the presence of oxygen. And hence, that's the reason why the anaerobic work, if it's truly anaerobic, if we're going anaerobic capacity stuff, if we're working functional reserve capacity, if we're working neuromuscular, that's the reason why the shelf life on that stuff is pretty short. Because at some point, working with not enough oxygen present, you have to back off of that interval. And so kind of tying this into what I've said presently, how do you know if the threshold work that you are doing is too difficult or the VO2 max work that you are doing is too difficult? There's the answer. You've gone anaerobic to the point where now you need to back off. Now you're seeing that power come down, or you're seeing that heart rate rise way too much. There's way too much cardiac drift in those intervals. So that's a giveaway for you. I know that this sounds, wait a minute, so you're telling me to ride easier. Most folks, the threshold work that they're doing is at too high of intensity, let alone the VO2 max work being at too high of an intensity. So what does that mean? What it means is you're not able to stack enough time to actually stress that system the way it needs to be stressed. Because if it's being done with oxygen, we should be moving into the realm of 30, 40, 60 minutes of threshold work in a session. Now you can't start there, but you can get there. When we're talking about VO2 max work, we're talking about getting into the realm of 10, 15, 20 minutes of VO2 max work, because you're fueling it with oxygen and it's doable. Now, obviously there's progression there in a training plan that will get you there, but that's what we're looking at. So sticking to those parameters that you're given when doing these kinds of workouts, if they're assigned properly, hopefully with the oversight of a coach, that's what's going to allow the most growth. Contrary to what we think, where it's like, okay, I'm going to completely smash these intervals and that's what's best for me in the long run. It actually isn't. All right, y'all. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this video. I hope it's beneficial. I hope you're learning something about your bodies, about how training plans are put together and things of that nature. If you're curious and you want to know a little bit more how the wheel turns, please reach out. Any questions you guys ask, nothing's off limits. I'd love to have a chat with you and engage with you. And at some point, maybe create a partnership here between you and I, and we can get some stuff done. Thank you guys so much for watching. Till next time.